patch 14.15 is out on the live servers. This is the first patch of the fucking new set, and honestly speaking, the balance has been so fucking on point. The team did such a good job. And in today's video, we're going to be doing a meta-analysis on patch 14.15. All the best openers because it's the first patch of the set. Ornn items which aren't as significant just because of the lack of encounters and there's just slightly less ways to get resources into the game. And then all of the comps, all the plus ones, everything you gotta know. Real quick though, before we start, again, a little bit of housekeeping. This is right now we are partaking in the box boot camp. We did lose a life last night, which kind of sucks, but this is the first weekend I actually just get to play because I've just been busy with work. So hopefully we won't be losing any more lives. And definitely for today, we are filming this live on stream, _kai. And I mean, I'm grinding fucking like 12 hours today, so like surely we're chilling. But anyways, also another thing to note, the first satellite tournament got announced over on Twitter. So Boise's is hosting the first one. It's called Phoenix's Dark Fair, I think, or Fairy, I don't fucking know. But it's on August 9th through 11th. You might notice that actually starts on a weekday. It actually starts on a Friday. Another thing to note is that if you are playing within snapshots and you're close to the snapshots, you might not actually be able to partake. I would say regardless, sign up anyways. But this is the same weekend as snapshots. So if you're trying to qualify for the trials via snapshots, this is actually the exact same weekend. So like logistically speaking, this isn't really ideal, but this is a great way for people who are like, maybe they're competitive, but they don't have enough experience in the scene. It's a great way to just get your feet wet and just try to see if you can get in and start really competing and, you know, getting a feel for it. The way that the signups work, I believe it's the top 2/3 of signups get in automatically, and then the bottom third, it's like open. So like anybody, like if you're silver, you could apply for this and potentially get in and try to compete for the first time. So really cool opportunity. These satellite tourneys are something that they are experimenting with since set 11, and so far they seem okay. I don't really know, you know, I wouldn't say they're more competitive than like the trials or cups, at least from what I've seen, but they're still a great way to get, again, your feet wet in the competitive scene. But anyways, let's get on to today's video. So first off, for the patch analysis, let's talk about openers. There are a lot to consider. Most of these openers lean into specific lines, so that's something you need to keep in mind. So for example, we'll just go through each of these. These are sort of like the main ones that I personally lean, but you have a lot that you can play around. Syndra, obviously, if you get a very early Syndra, you can start stacking up her ability. Basically, the more that she casts, the more damage she will do as the game progresses. She's a infinite scaling champion. So early Syndras are great, gets to lean you into Syndra Reroll, which we'll talk about a little bit later when we go over the comps. Portal opener is pretty solid as well. Zoe 2 is easily one of the best one costs currently at the moment. Really strong AP item holder, great to hold Shojin. Great to hold your Rabadons, your JG, whatever it may be, even a good blue buff holder. 30 mana, so really solid. Over here, Akali Nilah. This is more if you're specifically playing towards the Nilah variation of 2-cost reroll, which we'll talk a bit more later. It's slightly less meta than the kassadin reroll, which is the big one that we'll talk about later today. But still very solid. You could definitely still play like some sort of like warrior, and like if you have a Nilah 2, you could just like start itemizing her and start potentially playing reroll. Or you could play like Fiora. She could be like your Fiora item holder for your level 8 board. That's fine as well. Eldritch opener, still really solid. This is more of a tempo opener in my opinion if you have like upgraded units. The summon is pretty strong in the early game. It's not the strongest from what I've seen, but it's still a very solid opener, and it gives you like basically like a bunch of ways to play flexibly, more specifically with like 6 shapeshifter frontline, which we'll talk about a bit later with shapeshifters and flexing the backline. Another one to note, Honeymancy, really fun. It's just cool to see all the fucking bees. Like, it's fucking chill. But Ziggs is a really decent item holder. I think it's great. Potentially could lean you into Syndra if you find the Syndras because he is an incanter. Blitzcrank is one of the best tanks currently at the moment. It's just, a 2-star Blitzcrank is fucking, like, that's just like the Great Wall of China. You can't fucking break through it. Kassadin and Ashe, Akali, this is the multi-striker opener. This is something that is more akin towards Kassadin reroll. You could play into like vertical with Callista, or maybe you're doing like, I've seen like Akali 3, Callista 2. There's a bunch of ways to play this. You can do Ashe 3, Jax 3. It's not as good as Kassadin reroll, but still very solid. Kog'maw Namzi, this is specifically more for Kog'maw reroll. This Namzi doesn't have to be Namzi, it's just Hunter. Could be a Twitch, totally fine as well. Twitch 2 is actually kind of solid. I think it's a pretty underrated unit to be holding in the early game, but if you have a very early Kog'maw, it's a great way to lean into Kog'maw reroll. Galio, Lilia, Soraka, Seraphine. This is more of like a mage package in the opening. This kind of leans you a little bit more towards Veigar and Vex, but it's very AP flex. You can still play into Karma, the best 4 costs currently in the current meta with the 4 costs. That was very redundant. I'm sorry. But you get the idea. It's good for AP. It's good for your openers. But regardless, these are sort of like the top openers. And again, there are probably some other ones that I'm missing here. But these are the main ones that I thought I should mention because they are strong enough in the early game that you can still put it on your board. But also, you can lean into like specific lines. So this is something to definitely keep in mind. Ornn items, I want to quickly go over them. I don't think there's anything that is too egregious. But there are some things to keep in mind. Vamp, Sceptre, Warwick for Warwick reroll. I cannot speak on this line, but I've heard good things about it. So it's pretty solid. Things like Forbidden Idol, really great on like any sort of like strong tank with a shield. So like Rakan is really good. Wukong, Blitzcrank. I think Forbidden Idol Wukong is probably like really underrated. But again, it's one of those things that you don't see very often, and this would be for something like Wukong Jinx, which again, we'll discuss later. Vex is really good with Unending Despair. Trenchcoat in general, this is good for Briar, I can't pronounce her name right. But really good because she just has like AoE CC. It's just like a bunch of little Briars, like little dog shit children, like CCing the enemy board, like okay. Katarina with Blighting Jewel, this is more of a theory thing in case it ever becomes good. Like Katarina right now is just not a very good unit, but this could potentially be good. Blighting Jewel also on Karma is really solid. Wits End cast Geopi is really good. There is one more Wits End user in the current meta. I couldn't remember off the top of my head who it is, but there's one unit that's actually really good Wits End. But again, if you remember who it is, please let me know, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Nilah with RFC is theoretically pretty good. It's very similar to set 9 Nilah. I've yet to see it, but I've heard good things. Silvermere Dawn, this is more of a cook. This is stuff with like Poppy 3 with like Witching Wallop, her hero augment. Not the best, but it's still fine. Massis is also still like, this is a theory, this is more of a cook. Innovating Locket Mordekaiser is probably super solid. Right now, if you actually go into tactics.tools, the top comp is right now Syndra Mordekaiser, which it's really just Syndra, but if you have Mordekaiser 3 with as your front line with like Syndra 3 and like with this Innovating Locket on it, I'm pretty sure it's actually unkillable. So that's something to keep in mind as some deck. Horizon focus on Tahm Kench and Nami, very, very obvious. They just have a lot of CC. They just, you know, do a lot of damage. What is it called? Sniper's focus really good on Xerath and Nami as well. And Kassadin really likes Triforce and Mittens. Just a very standard, basic, like, AD sort of frontline. I mean, he's AP, but you get the idea. Like a frontline, like, in-your-face carry. I think the augment, whatchamacallit, the one that gives you a bunch of Infinity Forces. I can't remember off the top of my head what it's called. But that augment's very good in Kassadin. I think it's underutilized a little bit. I think it's actually pretty solid because Akali can use it really well. But again, we'll talk about that later. And then lastly, Zhonya's like Cassiopeia. It's fine. It's not like amazing, but it's definitely something to consider just because when she gets in her stasis, she actually still like ramps and casts a lot. So it's still pretty solid. But moving on, let's see. Oh, Kassadin can use Wits End. Okay. Thank you, chat. Yeah. So yeah, Kassadin with Wits End. I think that's right. But don't quote me on it. Chat said it. Anyways, moving on. Standard comps. So let's talk about the forecasts. Forecast board and son of a bitch, dude. Karma, dude. Fucking Karma, man. This is the hardest fucking forecast to play around. I think it's really fucking hard to play around Karma, and the reason I say that is because she is so flexible. There are an absurd amount of ways you can play her plus like a secondary duo carry. And I can't really speak too much on the line because I actually suck at this line. This is like my least favorite line because I just don't know the set well enough. And I don't feel like my pivots on 4-2 are flexible enough on level 8. But maybe yours are, so let's talk about it. The core is Karma, Rakan, Zillion. And Morgana, technically speaking. This is like your main core, bread and butter. Everything else is fucking what you hit. So like, for example, the highest capped version of this is like the Arcana Xerath, like dual carry with Karma. This is incredibly unlikely. You'll probably never hit this on 8 unless you find like a random Xerath, like 2 for some reason. I don't fucking know. But this is like a potential possibility you could play. Again, this is super high cap, so this is not very common on 8. The more common ones are Fiora Gwen or Karma Nami. These are a lot more typical that you'll find people playing around. I think Karma Fiora is probably the most common. It's just, basically, you have the core, and then you play a little cluster that fits with the secondary carry. So, Kalista, for example, works with Camille and Jax. So you find an early Camille, and you have Karma items, and you're starting to find, like, AD melee items, and you have, like, a Camille 1. You could probably start thinking about, like, playing, like, Karma Kalista, with, like, Camille as, like, your secondary. Really high cap, but your cap is obviously Camille, too, so it'll be difficult to find. Fiora Gwen is fine. Gwen is just not too hot of a 4 cost right now, so she's a really good TG holder in my opinion, but generically speaking, you don't really want to itemize her, or in most scenarios. You definitely want Fiora as your secondary carry, so if you're, you know, you have your 80 melee items, but you don't find the Camille, you can lean towards the Fiora, and again, this is probably the most meta, Karma and Fiora as a pairing. Karma and Nami it was also really meta as well during the PvE. It was a line that I think a lot of players were playing around, and it's solid, but I think people have found slightly more success with Fiora, at least statistically speaking, just based off the stats. So that's why I think this is a little more popular, but the Nami one's also a little harder to hit because you do want to have that Nora in there because that gives you the 3 mage. I believe it's Vex as well, and then you end up playing 4 Chrono. So that is another thing. So we can talk a little bit about the variations. Again, this is the main one. This is the 4 Chrono, 4 Preserver. This is 4 Preserver because Morgana's in here. You're probably not hitting a Morgana on 8 for the most part, but still fits in on 9, really solid. Again, really super strong board, but as you notice, it's really expensive. You have Fiora 2, Rakan 2, Karma 2, ideally Gwen 2. You need like a lot of 2-star 4 costs. So if you are trying to play this board and you're trying to like fast 9, you're doing something wrong, man. Like this board is expensive. It's turbo fucking expensive. But for staying level 8 and like securing your top 4, it's actually pretty solid. Another thing to note is that when it comes to 4 cost boards in general in this set, because reroll is slightly more prevalent in the meta and it's sort of the main way people are playing, a lot of people have pretty decent tempo throughout stage 3. And when that's the case, you will bleed quite a bit on your way to 8. So if you are not playing, you know, decently high tempo with high HP preservation on your way to 8, if you're like 30, 20 HP doing a roll down on 8, trying to like secure like a top 4, it's tough. You're gonna find yourself that if you, on your 4-2 roll down, don't hit your units, your upgraded units by the way, you will have a bad time. So be privy. Most of the time you're probably playing reroll, but sometimes you can lean towards these standard comps. But again, it's a tempo sort of situation. It's never something that you really want to lose streak into most scenarios. Again, this is the Arcana version. This is something that is more of a PvE cook. I don't know how good this is, realistically speaking. I still think it's solid, and the highest cap is insanely high, but it's fine. I think the Camille one is like decent enough, and I think it's this one. Yeah, this is the Camille one as well. It's 4 Chrono. Still very, very fucking solid line, but you have a bunch of different ways, and again, you can flex in fucking whatever. This is low-key a combination of like the Camille and the Xerath Arcana shit. Again, super fucking high cap. And you can also play around Kalista as your dual carry. That's totally acceptable as well, I think. But another thing to note, 6 Shapeshifter. This is sort of like the only other like 4 cost board that really comes to mind. This is sort of a board that you don't really angle on purpose. It's like you just have like this Elise 2, this Jace 2 during stage 2, and then you're just like, well, it's just fucking strong, and then your board is good, and then you have like a decent backliner, and then you're just like, fuck it, I can just tempo with like shapeshifters and like some pyro, and typically what ends up happening is that you end up with like a 6 shapeshifter front line, and then you just play like Varus in the backline. This is the easiest to tech in. But this is a solid line to secure top 4s, but it's gotten worse as the meta progressed because I think people are getting better and better at the set in general, and quite exponentially fast because people are starting to really realize reroll is so much better. And because this board has a lot of shitters on it, it's like you have a Shiv 2, you have like an Akali that's not really doing much. You have like Nico is actually a pretty solid unit, but this is usually like an Elise, and then maybe you probably have a Jace somewhere in here, so it's fine. But unless you have that pyro spat for 5 pyro, normally speaking, this line doesn't really cap out very high. So I would be wary. But again, if you're tempoing with it, there's absolutely no reason not to play it. And I actually think 6 Shapeshifter with Varus 2, especially if you can find it pretty early on like 4-2, it'll tempo you pretty safely into level 9. And then you can start trying to cap out in different ways there. There are other ways to play this as well. You can just flex your frontline with 6 Shapeshifters, and then things like Karma Nami is fine as well. For some reason, this actually has really high stats, and I think it's just because Karma as a 2-star 4 cost is just significantly better than any other 4 cost currently available. So it's just like, you might as well just put Karma. You could just jam a Karma in the back and just call it a fucking day. Like, it's probably fine. And again, this board, if you have it on 8, it'll tempo you to 9 pretty easily, but Karma, again, one of the most contested 4 cost units, so really unlikely you find it too often. But that basically does it for the standard comps. Let's go over to the 1 cost rerolls. 1 cost reroll is, it's there, it's present, but it's not as present as I would want it to be, I think, is what I'm trying to say. There, like, I think last set we had like kog'maw reroll, and maybe some like other ones that I can't remember off the top of my head, but it felt like we had maybe like a couple more viable options. This set, Ashe Jax, it was fine at the beginning, but again, because if you're playing multi-striker, you're probably playing Kassadin, so which is a 2 cost reroll, so you're not really leaning this line too often. Maybe a bunch of Ashes, you could like lean into it. It's a really simple line. It's just Ashe 3, Jax 3, you just roll on 5. Well, 4 on 3-1 and then level 5 if you don't find it by then, but Really solid line, and then all you do is Jack's just full AP. Like, literally full AP. And the reason being is that because his stats, they fully scale off of AP. I think it's like a 90% scaling or something like that. It's something really, really fucking high. And then his AP turns into his resistances. So that's why you're okay with, like, AP Jacks. Don't put tank items on this guy. It doesn't make sense. I think you just play vertical multi-striker, and it's pretty chill. Another thing to note for one cost... What the fuck is this one? This is Warwick reroll. Again, okay. I can't speak on this line, but I've heard good things about it. So I'm just going to toss it here. It's only okay with vamp sceptre, from what I've heard. I don't know if it's any good. If it is, cool. If it isn't, I tried to warn you. But just keep it in the back of your head. Maybe it's decent. Also, I did not go to this tab at all. So actually, I'm kind of getting jump scared. I don't know what else is in here. Zoe Poppy reroll. This shit's kind of ass. It's available. I would, generically speaking, avoid Witchy Wallop. I actually don't think this augment is very good, but this is a choice that you can make, especially if you have a lot of poppies 2-1. Maybe consider it, but generically speaking, I wouldn't play this shit. But it's just 6 vertical on the witchcraft. It's fine. I wouldn't say it's like particularly amazing. This is just an explorer page, but there's actually 2 more 1-cost rerolls I should talk about. The first is the Elise one, which is just 6 shapeshifter. And this is solid for, like, tempo. It's usually, like, Archangel's BT +1. Or, that's a Rabadon's, but you get the idea. It's usually +1. It can be kind of whatever. This is just a tempo to 9 type of situation. But, again, like I said earlier, people are getting better at the meta. So, people are starting to not get as dizzy throughout the early game. So, it's not necessarily as good as it was at the very beginning of the patch. And I think right now it's averaging, like, a very, like, average 4.5. So, like, it's a line you can take, especially if you have a bunch of Elises early game, because I think Spider Queen gives you an Elise 2 off rip. Yeah, it does. So if you have like 6 Elises right off the bat because you have like an Elise 2 and then you find this augment, I think it's actually pretty playable. So something to consider. Definitely solid. Again, the backline is very flex. It's very similar to the Varus board we talked about earlier, where you just put it in like anything in the back to flex. You can put in Karma, you could put in the Varus, you can put in whoever. It does not matter. Just flex something in the back to help support the Elise so that she can do her job. And in most cases, you should be able to get to 9 like relatively safely. I think the higher you climb, the less likely that is, but generically, it's still okay. The final 1-cost we should talk about, and this is actually some new tech. We did a video on this. When was this? This was a day or 2 ago. This is the Blitzcrank 2 tanky reroll line. This shit is solid as fuck, and I can only imagine that like with whatchamacallit, his hero augment, I think it's called Zap Attack. It can only be like I think Zap Attack and 2 tanky is probably like a giga first. This is actually like probably like you actually won the game for free. This line is fucking disgusting. It's so fucking fun, but it does require you to hit 2 tanky, so just keep that in mind. Blitzcrank, his itemization is just very simple. It's very straightforward. His ability scales off of HP. So things like Redemption, things like Warmogs, these are good, but obviously you want some resistances, so Gargoyles is usually fine. Something along the line of this with like Declaw or like a Warmog with like tempo slamming is totally okay. Again, we did a whole video on this a couple days ago, so you can check that out if you're really curious about it. But again, super solid. You can roll for Ziggs as your primary backline carry. It's totally fine because most cases you're rerolling on 5. But in the game that we had VOD reviewed the other day, I actually hit like 480 items, I think. So you can just instead just itemize kog'maw as your secondary carry and roll on 6. And then if you roll on 6, you're basically just playing some variation that looks something like this. And that's totally acceptable. And it's just fucking, it's bees. You can just type bees deafen and like you're super chill. Shout out to Raptor, by the way, because he was the one. We were actually in call. I talked about this in the last VOD. He was in call when we were playing this game together. When we first discovered it, and he was like, wait, theoretically, 2 tanky Blitzcrank sounds fucking hype. And we didn't have Zap Attack. We just had 2 tanky. And it went first. It went first against some built different boards. It went first against like some really high cap Karma boards. It was really strong. So don't sleep on this line. It's very, 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 very good. Worst case scenario, also, by the way, you can maybe play around Veigar 3 as well. It's really depending on what bees you find. But again, super fucking fun line. I highly recommend if you ever get the chance to play it. Moving on to the 2-cost rerolls here. This is, I believe, kog'maw reroll. This is sort of the main line. I think, yeah, this does look like the main line to me. Usually, there are other ways to play around it too. There's like a 2 healthy version where you're playing, what's her face? Tristana instead of Jinx, but Jinx in general is just higher unit quality. But if you're 2 healthy, obviously you want to play more 2 costs. But Blitzcrank is sort of your main tank, ideally. Nunu 3 just isn't as tanky for some reason as a Blitzcrank 3. I don't really know what the rationale or the reason behind it is. It just feels that way. kog'maw 3, super solid unit. Any 80 items you can just throw onto him. Blast Whisper is just kind of the only necessary thing in my opinion. But you want like Shojin or red buff. Ginsu's is like not that great on him, but like Shojin red buff is ideal. Just one of them so that he can just cast faster. And then IE is good, but also things like Deathblade is probably fine. GS is probably fine. But those use up pretty important components that you want for like your red buff and your last whisper. So infinite bows in this composition for certain, but still very, very solid. Again, Blitz 3, main tank. Rumble 3 is like, if you happen to find it. Nunu 3, really good TG item holder, but still really solid line. And I would recommend this to most fucking players. Arcana Hecarim, for the most part, you're not hitting a Zerath on 7, like, fucking ever. Reroll on 6 for obvious reasons. It is a 2-cost reroll board, but at the end of the day, very, very solid line. And probably the main AD line I think most players are leaning towards outside of... No, it is. It probably is. I can't think of a 2-cost reroll that's... more prevalent. Maybe like Akali, but like not really Akali, it's Kassadin. But anyways, speaking of Kassadin, moving on. This is like the meta terror right now, which is like Kassadin, Akali reroll. Super fucking solid line. Super fucking solid line. You have to really do your due diligence though and make sure you are uncontested. If you're contested for this line, it gets significantly harder to play. There's no real hero augment or anything in particular. It's just vertical multi-striker. But you just play for Kassadin 3, Akali 3, Ginsu's QSS BT, and then Akali really likes GA, by the way. GA is like her best performing item in the stats, at least last time I checked. So still, very solid fucking line. You usually play the Shen as well. This gives you Bastion and Pyro, and this is sort of acting as your main tank in most scenarios. In terms of actually positioning, I kind of like positioning like this, where your Kassadin isn't exactly on the far outside, like not A1 or A7. Reason being is that like when your opponent is playing, like let's say like a Kalista, which is probably one of your biggest counters, this will automatically target the person who's on the farthest edge. So by giving you a little bit more time for your Kassadin or whoever, it also gives time for your Akali to jump around and maybe snipe the backline. So this is sort of like the positioning tech, at least from what I've seen. Really, really solid. And again, really just fucking broken line, man. Like this shit is like actually like not okay, like low-key. Like this shit, like it feels really good. One last thing to note is that his itemization, Ginsu's is starting to become less relevant on him, at least from what I've seen. There was some discussion last time when I was playing this line about Rabadon over Ginsu's in this particular line. If you do end up going Rabadons though, it's like Rabadon's QSS BT specifically. So if you have the QSS BT and you can't find that last bow for your Ginsu's, you can actually smack a Rabadons on him and he feels pretty good. At least when I tried this shit and it felt good. So I can actually attest to it that I think this is actually pretty solid. So again, if you can't find that Ginsu's, Rabadons is good. And yeah, that's basically it. And then also one last thing to note, if you're getting contested for this line, because let's say Akali and Nilah, there's like one of those players in your lobby and you can't find the Akali 3, just once Kassadin 3, just push level, try to start playing around Kalista as your secondary carry. As long as you have, fundamentally, a second person just helping you with the fights, that will be enough. But again, Akali 3 is the ideal. Let's see. Moving on, Shapeshifter, fucking goddammit. This is Syndra reroll. Again, another terror in the meta. This is probably Kassadin and Syndra are the two biggest, like, meta abusers right now that you could play, that anybody could play. Really solid line. You lean towards this when you have an early Syndra and ideally a tier. But quite honestly, you could just sack early game and just get the tier anyways. But she's really solid in terms of like, just wants to cast, just infinite, because again, her ability is scaling infinitely. So things like Shojin, I think Shojin Nashers is ideal on her. But adaptive is probably very chill. One like damage item is probably fine. Rabadons is fine. I think the best in the stats, somebody had mentioned the best in the stats is like blue buff, Shojin, adaptive or some bullshit like that. But that's like 4 tiers. Like you're not hitting that shit. So that's just something to keep in mind. In terms of the primary tank, it's actually Neeko over Swain. People were talking about Swain being the best tank in the PvE meta, but now it's clearly Neeko. It's not even close. So ideally, Neeko 3 is what you are trying to itemize as your primary tank. But for obvious reasons, you are rolling on 6. So if you find the Shyvana 3 pretty early, you should just itemize your Shyvana as your main tank. Just be careful though, because when you itemize Shyvana as your main tank, she will sometimes cast and fly across the board like this. And then suddenly, your Syndra is fucking sitting there looking like a dumbass and just getting fucking wrapped on. So just keep it in mind. It can be scary sometimes having Shyvana as your main tank, but that's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. That's just how the cookie crumbles sometimes. Jesus, sorry. I feel like I'm like rap god right now. I'm just like constantly like this is all information that you should know. I'm gonna take a sip of coffee, but there might be some tech to the way that you position Shyvana with the way that her jump works. I have not tested anything, so I can't attest to anything, but there's gotta be something, man. Like I'm sure like if you have like a strong tank as well, like Shyvana on the opposite side is great, because if you have Neeko 3, then Shyvana on the opposite tank then flies over this side, and then you just have more tanks soaking up shit on your Syndra. So that could also be a thing. I think to note as well as Cassiopeia 3 is super solid. She is not a necessity by any means, but she's still very, very good. Her ideal itemization is literally just triple Ginsu's. So just keep that in mind. She just doesn't really want anything else. She just wants infinite attack speed, just ramp. I think I've heard Anger Issues is good in this comp. I don't agree, but I've heard of it, so it's fine. I think Anger Issues in most scenarios isn't that good. But you could run it. I could see the argument of like, oh, Syndra also just wants to cast infinite. Ginsu uses a bunch of attack speed, and then she can also cast infinite. But this Anger Issues augment is not ideal, in my opinion, in most scenarios. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, Anger Issues is actually a prismatic. Turns all your items into Ginsus, but they all get like armor and MR to compensate. It's just like your front line starts to feel kind of weak, which is why I don't like it. So it's a fun augment, but I don't particularly think it's amazing in this comp, so I would avoid it if possible. Moving on here, are these just more... Let's go here. This is Nilah Akali. Okay, let's talk about Nilah Akali. There's a couple of other 2 costs we should talk about too, but I'll bring them up later. Nilah Akali, this is sort of the line you play if you are contested for Kassadin. If you're contested for Kassadin, and you have like Kassadin items like a BT or whatever, you could lean into this instead. Nilah 3 is still very, very solid. Akali 3 is like okay, but she can like scam a lot of fights. She just jumps in the backline and just like obliterates the enemy carry. So really simple line. It actually fits very perfectly on 7 as well. So pretty cool line. Not much else to really talk about. It's just warriors and whatever. You could play 4 warrior. You could play like 5 multi for the Akali. You can play like Arcana and like Tekken more Arcana. There's so many different ways to play this line like post level 7. So just play what you hit. I know that's not very specific, but that's just, you know, that's just how it is. Another one to note as well is Daeja Vu. Daeja Vu is Galio's hero augment. It's really, really good. I think both the one at 2-1 and the both at 3-2 are solid. I think the Daeja Vu plus the one you got at 3-2 is slightly better just in the stats. But it's still a great line. It's just solid. All you do is just vertical vanguard. It's really simple, and you just play 3 mage. And the 3 mage can be anything. Ideally, it's like this. Yumi goes onto the Galio for obvious reasons. It always goes onto your carry this patch because the AP scaling and the AD scaling is just significantly better of a boost in DPS than like the healing on your tanks. Galio BIS for obvious reasons. It's like Ginsu's. I think it's like double Ginsu's +1. I've seen like double Ginsu Gunblade pop up in the stats here and there. I don't know how I personally feel about this. I think it's fine. You could do something like this as well. Ginsu's Gunblade Archangels, very similar to Daeja back in like set 7 with like yeah, I think that's correct. But like Galio 3, you want like Rumble 3. You could also go for like Mordekaiser 3. This is like a really high roll scenario. I wouldn't expect this in most scenarios, but this is totally fine. The reason why it's 6 Vanguard and not 7 Mage, if you notice in the stats, are actually very similar in Delta and average placement. But 7 Mage is significantly harder to hit because you are in a Nora lottery. Like ideally, you want to hit that Nora to hit the 7 Mage. So it's way easier to just try to find like a Tahm Kench because no one's really buying this unit. And then Nami, it's like somewhat contested, but not too hard to find. So, and she's not even a fucking Vanguard. She doesn't even like apply to my point. Like a Tahm Kench lottery is a lot easier to win than like a Nora lottery, so that's why you see 6 Vanguard being a thing. And also Galio just likes the fight to last as long as possible. He just keeps autoing and autoing and autoing, so you know how it would be. Like he just wants, it's a battle of attrition and he just wants to last as long as possible, so that's why 6 Vanguard is very good. There is an augment that's sort of an auto win with this comp. I'm trying to remember what it is off the top of my head, and I apologize that I did not set this up better in, you know, before I started fucking streaming. But it's the Vanguard augment. Not Vanguard Crest. Hello, does anyone know? Vanguard Crest is good in this comp? Yes, that is true. Does anyone know what it is? Hello? I really don't want to edit this. Hello? Does anyone know? I don't know. There is a Vanguard augment somewhere. It basically like shifts the shields around, but I don't remember exactly what it does, which is why I'm trying to find it. I'm going to give myself 5 more seconds to find it. And then oh, is it? Nope, it's not Raid Boss. I'll give myself 4 more seconds to find it, and if I don't find it, it is what it is. Oh, shields up. Okay, thank you. Yes, shields up. So, shields up. Your Vanguards have 30% stronger shields. Vanguards become immune to CC whenever they gain a shield. So, it doesn't sound amazing, but still super solid. And the stats with Daeja Vu shields up are pretty fucking egregious. So, take that into consideration. Really, really, really solid augment. So, thank you, chat, for helping me with that. In terms of 2-cost reroll, I think we've covered everything that's important to note. There is like a zillion reroll comp going around somewhere. I don't really know too much about it, and I don't think it's necessarily that good. So I'm just not gonna talk about it. Moving on, 3-cost reroll, significantly less comps to talk about. Thank fucking god. I'm starting to sweat low key. Let's start this one. We've been here for a minute. You know, just get up and stretch. But anyways, going into here, Jinx 3, Wukong 3. Really solid comp. This is like one of the main comps I think you can think about when you're playing around 80 for 3 cost. I don't think it's 400 though, is it? It might be 400. It is 400. It is 400. I remember looking at the stats and thinking, why the fuck is why is like 3 frost in there? But apparently 3 frost 400 is like pretty solid. You want sugarcraft in there eventually, because sugarcraft just gives you a little bit of bonus AD onto the Jinx. It can be literally fucking whoever. Gwen is probably acceptable. But this is a really solid line. It's really difficult to find spots to play this line, but like an early Jinx as like your primary carry throughout stage 2 into like early stage 3, it's actually really solid. This Jinx unit kind of fucks. So like if you have like an early Jinx, some AD lines, like a Ginsu Slam and like a Wukong somewhere along the lines, just some like beefy front line, you can consider this line. I think it's so good. I actually think it's so fucking solid, but it's really hard to hit all the conditions. But this Wukong 3 unit, no one's holding it, like ever. They use it as transitional units starting stage 3, but it's only like sometimes. So again, this line, I think if you're like, I want to play a line that I think nobody's going to be playing and you have a good spot for it, definitely consider playing this line. Super cool line. Oh, it's usually barred. You're right. Sorry. It is usually barred. Thank you for reminding me. Yes, it is usually barred. B for bard. There we go. Because it gives you preserver. That makes a lot of sense. Okay. There you go. That's the line. All right. Moving on. Next one to talk about is 7 Mage. This is the one of, I think, highest caps in the game. For whatever reason, this Veigar 3 unit, when you hit super late game, his ability scales off of the number of charms you buy. So every round during stage 4, where you are probably sitting on a Veigar 2, you want to be rolling every turn for a charm so that he can just continuously scales. And even if it breaks 50, which it usually does, getting those charms to eventually scale later into the game is super worth it. Because 3 AP for every charm you buy, let's say you have 12, 15 charms at the end, that's 45 AP. That is a fuck ton. It's a metric fuck ton. So make sure you buy charms throughout stage 4. And then that way, when you're buying charms throughout stage 4, you're also preserving HP. And that is where this comp is the hardest to play around, because during stage 4, you do notice you start to bleed a bit. So buying charms will really reduce that. Vexter is the obvious primary tank and pretty much only solo tank. You don't really want to try to solo frontline her. I've done it a couple of times, but it does feel a little bit bad. So just keep that in mind. Like, you do want some other stuff in the front to help her out. Usually you won't find Nora as well. Like we talked about before, 7 Mage is the Nora lottery. So typically what ends up happening is you end up playing 5 Mage and you end up playing Arcana in the meantime. So things like the Hecarim and the Ahri is actually really good. And I like this the most because it gives us slightly bit more frontline, but also because of the way that Arcana Ahri works, where I hope it says it somewhere, but well, it doesn't fucking say it, but this is awkward. But the Arcana for Ahri, basically, the more 3 stars you have, the more AP you get across your team. Oh, I remembered. Nice. But yeah, and then all you do is your Arcana Ahri, and you have, like, I think it's like 25 AP just for having 2 3 stars. So it's a lot of AP to have. So I think this is really solid until you hit the 7 Mage. But 7 Mage is definitely the highest spike. That's like insane critical mass. And then the Vex gets significantly tankier. So yeah, definitely for sure, tech out Arcana and then play 7 Mage if you can, if you ever find it. It's really tough. Your secondary carry in most scenarios is going to be Nami. Things like the Morello is really good on her. Things like Shiv, if you don't want to put a spark on your Vex, is probably very fine as well. Things like Shojin to cast a bit more, very solid. Yeah, very simple line. One last thing to note, I was doing this a lot, and you should be careful not to do this, but I was playing Seraphine over Soraka. No real particular reason. I just like Seraphine as like a carry throughout the early game. But Soraka actually has a little bit of healing innate in her kit. So trying to play the Soraka is really good for you. So if you need like that 5th mage, Soraka is probably your best bet until you find, again, the Nora, and then you have like the Seraphine, and then you can play 7. So anyways, you can win out games with this, by the way. I've won out games with this specific board, and I had like Nami 1. And like you can play like this. It's also, by the way, this board is really good against Kassadin. It actually like giga caps against Kassadin. The reason I say that is because it depends on your positioning, but let's say your opponent is playing like a Kassadin board, right? In general, the way that you want to position against him is that, let's say you're, it would look something like this, right? Something into the Hecarim, right? So this is like your opponent's board, right? Typically, they'll position in some fashion that looks like this. Usually. Something along the lines of like this, right? the way you position Veigar against this is that you put Veigar right on top of Kassadin, and then he will insta-cast onto the Kassadin, focus him down, and then your opponent doesn't have a carry. So Veigar's a really good counter to the Kassadin meta right now, so definitely something to consider, and I think this line in general is just very underplayed, so definitely consider this when you are trying to climb in the current meta. But that does it for the 3-cost reroll. Oh my god, we're almost done, guys. We're almost fucking done. Last thing to note are the +1s. Spats and emblems are so good this set. There are a lot of really solid +1s that you should know about, and they open up lines that are typically very uncontested. So if you have like a good emblem or a good spat to play around, you should consider playing those lines. The first one I want to talk about is 6 Witchcraft. There are 2 emblems here. This is usually one or the other. It's Gwen or Karma. And you just play Zoe. That's the unit that's missing here. But all you really do here is really simply put, you play around. It's basically you play standard, but 6 Witchcraft is super solid. It's a really solid line to be playing throughout the mid game and for like late game. And you have the potential to cap out with 8 Witchcraft, which is super fucking strong, by the way. I think 8 Witchcraft in most scenarios is like it's not an auto win, but it's super good. It's like a free like top 2 in most cases. So definitely can play around this. You want to be itemizing the Fiora as well. This is definitely just BT, Sterax, IE, Hodge, whatever the fuck comes your way, you can throw it onto her. It's totally chill. Nico 3, you might notice is on here as well. This is like a viable way to like cap out your tanks if you happen to find a lot of Nikos and it's not contested for some reason. Usually though, there is a Cassiopeia Syndra player in your lobby, so this is very unlikely. So most cases, you're just itemizing your Wukong as your primary carry, or sorry, primary tank. And then Cassiopeia 3, again, you can hold the Cassiopeias as you're playing this line, and that way you can grief the Syndra players. So that's the only reason why I have her here, but I wouldn't really focus on itemizing her at all, just because you have already so many units to itemize. Gwen, well, it's Karma, Fiora, and Rakan or Nico, right? So whoever your primary carry is, plus these. It's a lot. That's 9 full items, 18 components. Gwen is really good in this line because she works really well with Fiora. You might also notice that your secondary carry is also going to have the Witchcraft emblem on it. It's just because, again, it spreads Witchcraft very easily. So you're going to want to have something like this, or again, the Karma in the backline. Red buff Rabadon's totally chill. Really solid line. Moving on. Oh, sorry, one last thing to note. Potions. Don't fucking click on this shit. This shit's terrible. Maybe it's fine in 6 Witchcraft. Okay, you know what? Let's look at it. But I'm pretty sure on my mother, this shit is fucking terrible. 6 Witchcraft potion. It gets worse, man. It gets worse. So yeah, don't ever click this augment, man. It's so bad. Hopefully they buff it. It's good in 6 Witchcraft, but I think that might be a huge new baiter. So just be careful. Next one to talk about is 6 Sugarcraft. So Sugarcraft emblem. This is like, it was strong during the PvE, but I think most people have gotten better at learning the meta and playing the meta. So I don't know if it's really that good anymore. The only time it's like basically like you always want to play it is Sugarcraft Crown, not the crest, the crown. And excuse me, the reason being is that because with Sugarcraft, the crown gives you a redemption. It gives you an extra item to help farm you those early sugar stacks. Because if you don't know, the way that it works is that you basically start building a layer of cake, and then you get more sugar to build the cake with, the more components you have slammed, or the more items you have slammed. So that is why the crown is really good, and the gold one is like kind of like mid. You could still play it if your Sugarcraft spot's like insane, I guess, but it doesn't actually give an item or a component. So it's actually significantly harder to get that ball rolling. So Sugarcraft Crown, definitely consider it, but Crest, I'd be a lot more hesitant trying to play around it. But definitely something to consider. In terms of your secondary carry, with the crafted emblem, it's probably going to be Fiora. GABT is just really solid. She's just a warrior, just like Gwen. Really, really great. Tahm Kench is sort of the main sort of thing you can put in. Again, Rakan is in the board as well. You might notice Rakan, this unit, I don't know why it's TG'd. It's going to probably be your main tank if you happen to need one, which you probably do. Redemption is fine. Things like Vow is probably good. Like, generic tank items is super solid. Just something to keep in mind. Really, really solid line to be playing around. And again, the cap out for this board is super high because if you finish the cake and you hit max stacks, which is like 21, 2200, it's an auto win. It's basically an auto win. I don't know if it beats 10 Eldritch, but it's fucking close. So just keep that in mind. Really insane cap. It's really hard to finish the cake, so just keep that in mind. Most scenarios, it's probably like a top 4. But yeah, so super solid line. Next one, Eldritch. I think Eldritch +1 is super good. The reason being is that because if you have the +1, you get to fit 3 mage on your board very comfortably, which is super good for your Nami. And hitting a Nora early is going to have like incredible effects for your entire team. Yumi obviously goes onto the Nami here. You just play vertical. Really simple. Vex is typically the one who's going to be item holding in general. If you can try to hold Vexes to grief Veigar Vex players while playing this line, that's actually super solid. That's not something I really considered until after playing this myself the first time, so something to keep in mind. There is also, I believe it's called School Mascot, is the Eldritch. Yep, this Eldritch augment. It's solid. I would say, like, if you have an Eldritch opener and you have School Mascot, you can still play School Mascot, lean Eldritch, and then try to lean into, like, try to find a spat somewhere along the way. It's probably good that I also look at the augment stats before I start yapping away about how good this shit is, but I'm pretty sure it's good. Yeah. It's insane. It's actually, oh my goodness. Man, I'm on one today. So yeah, 3.7. Very fucking solid. So, really great line, and also, just keep in mind, the Eldritch summon scales off your unit's star level. So, for the spat holder, make sure it's a 2-star. Keep that in mind. Vex 2 is the ideal holder. It's kind of like your only holder, but like don't leave it on Nora. It makes no sense. It also doesn't give her any stats. So, yeah. Something to consider. Moving on, 8th Portal. Very top 4, in my opinion. It's not necessarily like a crazy good line by any means, but it's a really solid line to secure top 4s. And if you have a good portal opener, as long as you itemize your Zoe, don't care if it's Zoe 1, itemize your Zoe. Don't do what I did, where I got baited. I got an early Ezreal, and I itemized my Ezreal 1 because it was my strongest board on 2-1. But then I had a Zoe 2 like a couple rounds later, and then I couldn't transfer items over, and then I had to give up 6 portal. It was a mess. Just itemize your fucking Zoe. It's a great unit, and you can honestly stick on Zoe 2 until like fucking stage 4. And then when you pivot onto Rise, it's totally solid. She can hold all the Rise items perfectly fine for you. Again, the reason why the portal spat is so good is because you can get to throw in a Vex. You might notice Vex is really great to splash in a lot of comps for 3 mage. Really solid, especially because 8 portal, you need Nora, which is Nora Lottery. It's kind of hard to hit, but it's fine. You'll find it eventually. If you can't find the Nora, you can drop down to 6 and play Bastions instead with Taric. That's totally acceptable as well. Taric 2, Rise 2 is really what you want in this comp at level 8 before you can really just think about pushing 9. And then when you go 9, you just get like Bastions with like a Diana. You could do fucking whatever. It does not really matter. Vanguard, like maybe there's a way to tech in Arcana. I don't fucking know. But yeah, Witchcraft as well, like a Morgana, super solid as well. A lot of different things you can do. So, very solid line, very good for top 4s. Rise itemization, real quick. Shojin, Rabadon's Archangels. There were some speculations about Ginsu's being good on Rise, and they're correct. It is good on Rise, but it's Ginsu's or Shojin. At the end of the day, it's all about the mana generation. The reason why people thought Ginsu's is good on him in the first place is because he has attack speed scaling built into his kit. Which is why people were like, oh, Ginsu's is good, he'll scale longer as the fight goes on, yada, yada, yada. But this board in general, from my experience, just kind of lacks frontline for the most part. So I'm not the biggest fan of Ginsu's, but I see the argument for it, and I think it's okay. So just bear that in mind. Again, very top 4 board in my opinion. Like, it's a solid 3rd, solid 2nd. I mean, honestly, if you're playing a lower elo, it's probably like actually pretty easy to like go like top 2 with it. So it's a very straightforward line, very simple. Zoe item holds everything, thrown onto a Rise. Don't fucking throw it onto an Ezreal. That shit does nothing. Good. Very good. Moving on. This is not a good line. I'm going to say this right now. This is a terrible fucking line, but I wanted to talk about it. Some people were talking about how they were looking at Varus items, like his BIS items, and in the stats, Frost Varus is really fucking good. If you look at the stats, it's a 3.89. And if you look at his items, his best fucking items is Frost Emblem. So you're probably looking at this shit like, holy fuck, Varus is amazing. But you probably got spoiled a little bit. It's not 7 Frost. It's actually fucking mid as hell. So what ends up happening is the reason why these stats are so good with Frost Varus is because 9 Frost exists. And if you exclude the stats from 9 Frost, 4.58. And actually, you're more likely to not top 4 than top 4. You could play 6 Blaster, and then maybe there's like a Frost Emblem line with it somewhere. But generically speaking, if you get a Frost Emblem, you're not really thinking, oh, I'm playing 6 Blaster Varus. So I thought in the stats, this is just one of those times where like it's very easy to get baited by the stats and think like 7 Frost is very good. But you gotta make sure you do your research diligently and making sure you're not getting baited by such shit lines. Because this shit sucks. It's not good. It is not good. But anyways, that basically fucking does it. This was a fucking hour, man. Like, this was a long-ass fucking meta-analysis. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I hope you guys learned something. And if you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments. Again, we do all these on stream. That's why you see chat over on the right-hand side over there. And the stream link, you know where to find me. Description, link in the below. You get the idea. Link, description in the... fuck you. All right, anyways, that's it. Take care, guys, and happy climbing.